is that to wage a war of aggression is to create the environment in which the worst human instincts will emerge, in which we will not only victimize others, kill them, maim them, destroy their families, destroy their societies, destroy a whole city and call it peace, as we've done in Fallujah, but because we will turn our own young men and women into killers and into torturers. This is a reason not to use war to promote a free society, rather to choose the other means which are at our disposal. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Hanson will now have 5 minutes for the affirmative rebuttal.
I think that was a very elegant talk, and there's many things I would agree with, but I'd like to take issue with 5 or 6. War is terrible, and probably the worst century for war was the 20th century. More people were killed on the battlefield in the 20th century, perhaps 70 million people, than all the 20 centuries of the modern age since Rome combined, given the use of industrial warfare. That being said, war was not the great killer of the 20th century. If you count all the people who were killed off the battlefield by Hitler, by Stalin, by Mao, by Milosevic, by the Cambodians, there were more people killed off the battlefield, and they could have been saved, only tragically so, by the use of force. If you think of the 5 great isms in your lifetime and your grandparents and your great-grandparents that made life miserable for people in the West: chattel slavery of the South, Italian fascism, German Nazism, Japanese militarism, Soviet communism. If you tally the sheet of misery and ask yourself, how did that end? It only ended by war, tragically so. Nobody says that war is good, but there's things worse than war. I wish that the secessionists, 3% of the Southern population, like the Islamists, had hijacked a noble Southern culture. They were the wealthiest people in the history of civilization. There was no way in the world they tried, they talked. There was no way they were going to give up slavery because it was the most profitable industry imaginable. And when General Sherman went down and left Atlanta and he got to Georgia, the secessionists said to him, for the first time in 20 years, go over to Carolina. They started it. Now, what made him say that and let 40,000 slaves go? Because they were good men? No. Because they were afraid of somebody who had principle and resolve and courage. And the people in the Army of the West, from people like this area of New Hampshire, were great men. They weren't war criminals. And war alone stopped those people, and it stopped Hitler, and it stopped what the Soviets would have done to millions of others. I wish that we could put our faith, as was said, in world opinion. But you know, I'm skeptical of world opinion. In 1941, if we had looked at world opinion in June 1941, think of it. The Germans from the English Channel to 40 miles outside of Moscow, from the Arctic Circle all the way to the Sahara Desert, was all Nazis, and they were going to kill every Jew in Europe. And what were people saying in Spain? What were people saying in South America? What were people saying in Mexico? They were saying that democracy was weak and decadent, and the future was with the Nazis. That was world opinion. And what did they say in 1946? You could not have found a Nazi who said he was a Nazi in the world. So discredited had that concept been made by the Americans and the British through war, tragically. I wish that democracies could come through peace, but the record, I think, is a little bit different than was implied. Noriega did not step down because he was a nice man. Milosevic killed 250,000 people while the Europeans waited for the UN to do anything. I met once with a Dutch ambassador, and I said, is it true that 7,000 Dutchmen under UN auspices put headphones on so they wouldn't have to hear the people butchered nearby in Srebrenica? And he said, yes. What stopped that? U.S. Air Force stopped that. And what happened? They were caricatured as bombers. If the U.S. Air Force had not done that, they would have ended all Muslims in Europe. That was what Milosevic would have done. And I wish the Philippines would have been peaceful, but the Philippines had democracy because Paul Wolfowitz went over there. Evil Paul Wolfowitz, and told Mr. Marcos, no more. This isn't the Cold War. If it was wrong to support you, if it was wrong to support you in the past, it's right to get rid of you now. And that was a threat. Just like Africa and apartheid was ended through the threat of sanctions and eventual force. If you put your confidence in the UN, I would like to. It's a wonderful concept. But when I look at Rwanda, 2 million. When I look at Milosevic, 250,000. When I look at Darfur, I see nothing. You know why I see nothing? Because the only time most of the people in the UN General Assembly vote is when they're in New York. And when they go back to their autocratic regimes, they're not accountable to the people. And a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And people will let people die, innocent babies, women, children, waiting for the UN to do something. We saw that with the tsunami. The UN had a wonderful idea, but what put helicopters and food in the islands of Indonesia with the Abraham Lincoln, U.S. aircraft carrier? I wish we could disarm after the Cold War. But I don't believe that war is just an aberration of 1945 to 2000, no more than the Civil War was, no more than the War against the Roses, no more than the Peloponnesian. If you want peace, as Vegetus said, you have to prepare for war. And classical deterrence, as horrible and as Neanderthal as that sound, saves more lives than utopian pacifism. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now have 5 minutes for Mr. Edsforth for the negative rebuttal.
Well, let me start by responding to Professor Hanson's last remark. Classical deterrence is not aggressive war. Classical deterrence is something different. It may have, and depends clearly on, the threat of force, but it isn't launching an invasion or sustained air bombardment. Let me also point out that in the case of the Philippines, this is not a place to debate the details of those events. It was not aggressive warfare, but in fact, the indication that there would be no intervention, there would be no war, that was responsible for the decision that Marcos made to step down when the people in the streets confronted the tanks and said, "Shoot us if you dare." And they didn't. The proposition before us has to do with using aggressive warfare to promote free societies. In the 21st century, not the 5th century BC, not the 19th century, not the middle of the 20th century. Of course, world opinion is different since 1941, since most of the world went through World War II and had the shit kicked out of them, had their cities destroyed, suffered millions of casualties, experienced what war was really like in the 20th century. 9/11 wasn't even an afternoon in World War II. Imagine that kept up for months on end. You might come out the other end of it thinking that war isn't the means to bringing about peace. It's a way to commit mass murder. I think the question before us is, are we capable of learning as humans and change, and because we are animals who can change our environment, changing our environment in such a way that that which we abhor becomes less and less likely. I think that is the transformation that's underway.